Hello, everybody. My name is Renato Zane, and I'm the volunteer chair of the BC Schizophrenia Society Foundation. Welcome to our event today. I don't know how much you've heard of what I've just said, but I just want to say good morning, everyone. Before we get started in a couple of minutes, I just wanted to run some polls on this particular platform that we're on today. I wanted you to hope you've had a chance to see some of the interesting facts on the screen. And before we get started, just wanted to run a couple of poll questions with you. It's just some fun things to get us started. So the poll question number one for everybody is, would you rather live in the Arctic or in the Sahara Desert? Please select the choice that you wish, and then we will show you the results. Well, there we go. 76% would rather live in the Arctic than in the Sahara. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. So as part of this warm-up exercise, we're going to go to poll question number two. And that is, would you rather time travel back to the past or to the future? So as we get used to using this particular feature on our webinar, just think about whether you'd rather travel back in time or forward in time. So I'm just waiting for the results, and we'll see what you all think. Wow, it's pretty close, but 58% would rather go to the future. Well, let's hope that the future will be one without excessive global warming, and that we will have solved our energy issues and our climate issues in the future. That's very interesting, but still 42% were also okay with going back to the past, which is kind of neat as well. Okay, last question, which is, now I'm going to ask you, this particular question is just to get ourselves warmed up for using the chat box. So I hope you know where to find the chat box. It's on the bottom of your screen. If you can't see it, just move your cursor and it'll pop up. So please reply in the chat window. And the question is, what is your particular favorite superpower? This could be your particular talent in a particular field, or something that I guess you wish you had. Just go ahead and write anything you wish in the chat box. Instinct, freeze time, compassion. Thanks, Phyllis. Trying to understand things. It's great to see your answers in real time. Wonder Woman always wondering. Banana bread. Good for you, Jean. Putting others at ease. Thanks, Denise. You could put me at ease. And yeah, Colleen's got a funny face. Thank you, Colleen. Flying. That's fantastic. All right. Well, as you're continuing to type, I'm just going to wait for a moment to see when we're ready to start. I'll be back with you in a minute as I get my cues from the producers behind the scenes. So thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this year's BC Schizophrenia Society Donor Appreciation event. If you didn't hear me earlier, I can let you know that my name is Renato Zane, and I'm the volunteer chair with the BC Schizophrenia Society Foundation Board. Today, I'm actually in Ontario, and I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples of Southwestern Ontario. But I want to recognize that the BC Schizophrenia Society and the BC Schizophrenia Society Foundation works and supports people across our beautiful province of British Columbia, with much of the work happening on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, primarily those of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And we are very thrilled that this virtual event can reach people across BC and beyond. This event, as you know, is our opportunity to thank you for your generosity and to show you how your donations have made a difference to families affected by schizophrenia and serious mental illness. We are extremely grateful for the support of our sponsor, the Otsuka-Lundbeck Alliance. Through their support, not one single donor dollar was diverted from our programs to pay for this event. That's amazing. Not one single donor dollar was diverted to pay for this event. That's just wonderful. Thank you, Otsuka. Through their support over the years, it means that donors and families alike are able to learn more about schizophrenia, its impacts, what treatments are available, and the research that is happening. Today, we have really an exciting lineup for you and sincerely hope you can stay with us until the end. We've made today slightly longer than usual so that we can take more questions from you all before we end today's event. You'll hear from Phaedra Aldridge, Chief Executive Officer of the BC Schizophrenia Society, Phyllis Dyson, a daughter whose love of her mother led her to write a book about her mom who lived with schizophrenia, and of course, Dr. William G Hohner, the Jack Bell Chair in Schizophrenia at UBC. But above all, this event is about you, our donors. So since we can't give you lunch today, we're giving you more time with Dr. Hohner to ask your questions. We're so grateful for your support, and we hope that you will notice your name on the screen at the bottom during the course of today's virtual event. As you know, the mandate of the foundation is to raise funds in support of the British Columbia Schizophrenia Society, including family support programs, advocacy, and education. The foundation also provides funds to support scientific research about schizophrenia. Before I introduce Phaedra for her update, I'd like to recognize the volunteers who serve on the foundation board with me. They are Jeff Bagshaw, Bob Baker, Elaine Pura, Bob Kenward, Margareta Dovgal, Gwelda Redman, Joanne Leung, and Chris Sandy. For the last 5 years, Chris has been the chair of this fall campaign, and in each of these years, he has made the offer to personally match donations up to a total of $10,000. He does this in memory of his younger brother, Dave, who sadly is no longer with us. If you're not familiar with Dave's story, you can read all about it in Chris's letter on the BCSS Foundation website. We are deeply honored and appreciative to Chris for his commitment and for his dedication to our cause. We applaud him. Thank you, Chris. You should know that your donations have made it possible for BCSS staff to provide support and education to hundreds of families every year. This past year alone, 851 new families received help from BCSS. And the demand is continuing because of the ongoing challenges faced by families with vulnerable loved ones who are dealing with COVID-19 and the aftermath of natural disasters this year, the wildfires and the floods. Your support continues to be vital. We need you so you can respond and we can respond to help these desperate families. Despite this upheaval, our BCSS regional educators and managers have managed to ensure that family support groups are running regularly, strengthening families together courses are being offered, and updated resources are being shared with families like yours, whether it's in person or virtually. Through courses, workshops, drop-ins, and online resources, the Kids and Teens in Control program helped more than 200 kids and youth build ways to cope with family members affected by schizophrenia or other mental illness. So all of this would not have been possible without the generosity of donors like you. So thank you very much. You're wonderful. But let me introduce now Phaedra Aldridge, the CEO of the BC Schizophrenia Society, who can tell you more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this year's Donor Appreciation event. My name is Phaedra Aldridge, and I'm the CEO of BCSS. The purpose of today's event is to thank you and to celebrate you and everything that we as a team have been able to do this past year. BCSS, as we all know, is incredibly unique. We support families across the entire province. We support families in a multitude of ways, strengthening families together, our family support groups, our one-on-one support for families, as well as working with our younger generation through our Kids and Teens in Control programs. We also provide education through our podcast, through our videos, to try and increase awareness about serious mental illness and attempt to decrease all the associated stigma surrounding and continues to surround serious mental illness. I am so truly grateful for all the support that BCSS has received this past year. I'd like to specifically thank Maxine and Otsuka-Lundbeck for your support for this event. Would not be possible without your support today. Thank you for that. Both boards, all volunteer members, the society and the foundation boards, thank you. My amazing team across the province, all our frontline educators, our regional managers, as well as the provincial office team, Cynthia Loveman, Andrew Stewart, Jean Fong, just to name a few. Thank you. We would not be able to do this without all of you. You're amazing. And to you, our donors, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your letters. Thank you for your support. And thank you for your financial donations. Last year was not easy with the floods, the fires, the global pandemic. 40% new families reached out to our organization last year alone, 40%. And the only reason we were able to do it was because we did it together. So thank you to everybody who helped BCSS this past year and get through some very difficult times. As I said, it was not easy. And then you throw in serious mental illness and loving and caring for somebody who has schizophrenia or another serious mental illness. It's incredibly challenging. Thank you for your continued support. Next year, BCSS will be celebrating 40 years in existence, 40 years. And I truly hope that we are going to be around for 40 more years, if not more. But that will only be possible with everybody continuing to work together to increase awareness about serious mental illness, to decrease the associated stigma, and to continue providing the necessary support that our families need throughout the province. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your continued support. I am so truly, truly grateful. Thank you for everything. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Phaedra, for reminding us how we as donors are all making a difference in the lives of people affected by schizophrenia. And let's hope that we don't have to wait 40 years, another 40 years. It would be wonderful if this illness was cured by then, or a treatment that was much more effective. So let's keep our fingers crossed. This year, the Otsuka-Lundbeck Alliance was unable to join us in person, but they know the importance of this special event to us all. It is one of the many activities it supports at BC Schizophrenia, and we want to thank them again for their ongoing support. Every year, we highlight one family's journey with schizophrenia. And this year, I had the opportunity to sit down with Phyllis Dyson, who has written this year's campaign letter, to ask her questions about her personal journey and how her mother's illness affected her as she grew up. Here it is. Phyllis, your letter to our donors starts with the description of your 10-year-old daughter's question to you. She said, I'm paraphrasing, but how old was your mom when she died, I think? And that question seems to have been a catalyst for you for some really significant things in your life.
So my daughter's question just made me realize all the trauma that I hadn't really dealt with, I guess. And it just made me think, how am I ever going to explain to my 10-year-old daughter the tragic way my mom passed away, like my mom was killed. And so it was really troubling for me. And I just left the room after I kind of changed the subject first, because I didn't know how anything else to do. And I left the room and just tried to sort out my thoughts.
And what happened after that?
And then, I went to work. I just went on and about my daily life. I'm a teacher, so I went to work and tried not to think about it too much. Being a teacher, I had an opportunity to take a workshop through my school district on mental health, learning about psychosis and how stress can cause a relapse and how people go through stress and relapse and recovery stages. It just really sent me into turmoil, basically turmoil. And so between my daughter's question and the workshop, it just was the catalyst for me to find out more and to understand more. After my mother's tragic death, I went on. I think I was in shock. It was too much for me to process as a 20-year-old college kid. And so I just kind of shoved it under the carpet, I think, or as a way of dealing with trauma. I think that's how the brain deals with it. We just can't cope with it, so we don't. And so for 10 years, for sure, 10 years, I just kept going on with my life until I was about 30, 31. And then I decided to do my graduate diploma in special education. I'd already been a teacher now by this point. And then I did my graduate diploma in special education, and I had the opportunity to research schizophrenia. And so at age 30, that's when I really started a journey that got me to where I am today. It was a 20-year journey, really. But it's taken me a long time to sort of learn and fully understand my mother.
What are your fondest memories of your mom?
I always say my mom is the one that sparked my love of reading, because she took us to the library. And we went to Deer Lake a lot. Deer Lake has a really fond place in my heart. We loved it. It was like a piece of heaven to me. We'd go swimming. We'd rush right in the water, basically. We'd splash each other and just have lots of fun. And we'd come out, and go on the swings and have picnics. So it was lovely. Yeah, really lovely. And my brother and I keep up that tradition today. Just go to Deer Lake in her memory.
You shared with us a photograph of your mom that's one of your favorites. Could you tell us about this picture?
And I just love this picture because it shows how much she was loved, how much my grandmother, her mother, loved her, and just the primping of the curls and I love the blush, her cheeks and her smile, and I can see my mother in here.
Could you tell us about the time that you ran away from home when you were little?
Yeah, so I was 8.5 when that happened. I didn't know that my mom had stopped taking her medication. I think it's because she didn't want schizophrenia. Like, nobody wants to be ill. And she'd had so many years of recovery that she thought maybe she was cured, but she wasn't. But my brother and I didn't even know she had schizophrenia. We didn't even know she took medication. So we'd had an argument, and she'd been acting strange for quite a while now. And I just had enough. And I came in one day, I can't even remember what we argued about, but my mom's just like, that's it. I've had enough of you, get out. And I was like, fine, I'm done too. I'm leaving. And I couldn't believe, this isn't I knew it wasn't really my mom. I think it's interesting that at 8 years old, I knew this wasn't really her, because I'm like, how could my mom say this to me? My mom loves me. This isn't right. Where is this coming from? So I knew it was coming from somewhere, but I didn't know where. But I was still mad enough to just leave the house. A lady brought me into the police station.
It seems that you blamed yourself for what happened to your mom and how you and your brother ended up with your aunt and uncle. When did you first become aware that you had this feeling of guilt? So
we were taken by our social worker to a courtroom, my brother and I, and my uncle was there. And then he was, hey, you're coming with me. Come on, you're going to come with me. And I'm like, oh, I thought he was going to take us back to my mom's. But he didn't. Instead, he took us back to his place. And that's when he explained that, you'll be staying with us for a while. And that's when my voice in my head said, this is my fault. This is because I ran away. Because I realized that the courtroom, a decision was made, and the decision was going to be that we weren't going to live with my mom anymore. And that was because of me, because I ran away and the police picked me up, and that was that. So I didn't realize, but I carried that guilt for a long time.
How often were you and your brother able to see your mom after you had been taken to live with your relatives?
Once she was feeling better again, doing better after a few months. It was about once every 2 weeks, I'd say, just for an afternoon. We'd go for lunch or just go to a park or something. Eventually, my aunt and uncle moved away, a long ways away, up to the Caribou. And so when we moved to the Caribou, we only saw her a couple times a year after that. So it wasn't very much.
What were those visits like for you? How was it for you?
was awesome. We had fun times, and we'd watch movies a lot together and just go for walks and play frisbee in the park, things like that. Just fun, simple things. That didn't involve a lot of money. If a parent's separated, sometimes that other parent, the parent that the child lives with, they get stuck with the day-to-day stuff and all the homework and all this stuff, right? And then they go see their parent, other parent for a weekend, and then it's all fun because they get to do the fun stuff, right? So my mom was kind of like that fun parent. And I didn't know it then, but she actually, would skip meals just to save money so she could give us spending money when we went to see her. But I wasn't aware of that back then, that she did that. And it just makes my heart grow for her and just love her more that she did that for us.
At what age did you realize that she had been diagnosed with the illness?
I was 14 when she told me. She kind of confided in me and said, "Oh, Phyllis, did you know sometimes God speaks to me through the radio?" And I'm like, what do you mean? At 14, that doesn't make any sense. And so she's like, well, maybe it's because I have schizophrenia. And then I didn't know what to do. I never heard of this word. I did not have any clue what schizophrenia was. And no one ever talked about it. In my family, they never said that word. It was like the word was like taboo. You just don't speak of it.
It seemed like she went through a time where things were much better, and you had become a teenager, and then she went off her meds again. So what led to her going off her medications after such a long time of relative stability?
She lost her housing, and my brother and I didn't realize how stressful that could be for her. Because we're college kids, and my brother and I had no idea how much stress that put on our mom, because we had no idea how schizophrenia affected her. So it was things just went downhill from there. Her life didn't have to end the way it did if she could have got help.
Let's talk about the book. So you've completed it. You told me earlier that it took 4 years to write. Can you tell us what that was like for you?
I basically grieved my mother as I was writing. so it was, but it was a good journey. I feel like I'm finally talking about my mother now, because I realized that, I realized how much she went through. It was really hard to do. It was really difficult. I had no idea how ill my mom could be. And, but by writing it, I was able to sort of sort out the feelings that all those feelings that I hid. And I realized that I didn't know felt guilt. And honestly, today, there is sometimes still some guilt, because I always think if I had known, if I could have done, if I could have, if only, right? But I know deep down that it wasn't my fault. Her death wasn't my fault. And us taking away wasn't my fault. I just loved my mother even more, because I realized how much she had to deal with, and how it must have been so hard for her to be alone. When she had her first relapse when I was 8, to me, outside of my grandmother, I find that she was very alone. And I think some mental health nurses were there, but there were other people that were not supportive of her. And I just find how hard that would have been. And she was only in her 30s, when that happened. And it's just, my heart really just grew for her.
You talk about, how you and your brother feel your mom's spirit. You talk in the book about how you and your brother went to some of those places like Deer Lake and other places, and sort of, he had a nice way of sort of putting it. And I'm wondering if maybe you could share it with us.
We actually went back and looked at the places where we'd lived with our mom. He said to me, and he turned to me, our mother hasn't really left us, her spirit lives, and he lives in the deep blue sky. Her spirit lives in the blooming plants. Her spirit lives in our hearts. And I knew he's right. Because, when we go, I can feel her. I can see her. I can feel her, hear her laughter. I can feel her love whenever we go to Deer Lake. Okay, I'm getting teary now. And it's just, and he's right. When you lose somebody, it's hard to lose anyone, no matter, And but they do. They live in our hearts, and we can cherish their memories. And my mom shaped me. You know, she made me who I am today. And I'm really, you know, I'm proud of my mom, and I think she would be proud of me.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think that a lot of people can relate to Phyllis's story. And I'd really like to thank you, Phyllis, not only for taking the time to share your journey with us today, but also for being with us on this webinar. For those of you who are curious, Phyllis's book is called Among Silent Echoes, and it's a memoir of trauma and resilience. You can find a link to the book and learn more about Phyllis and her journey by visiting bcssfoundation.org. In addition to everything we've talked already about today, the BCSS Foundation is also invested in building a better understanding of schizophrenia, its causes and treatments. You, the donors, have made it possible through the gifts that you have designated specifically for research. Recently, through our partnership with the Michael Smith Health Research BC organization, we provided a research trainee award to Dr. Rafał Skiba of Poland to work with Dr. Todd Woodward at UBC's Cognitive Neuroscience of Schizophrenia Laboratory to collaborate on a 3-phase study on understanding the impacts of metacognitive training for people living with schizophrenia. And we are excited that we're going to be announcing a new partnership award in the next couple of weeks. So please keep an eye on our website for information. That's bcssfoundation.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our featured guest for today, Dr. William G Hohner. Welcome, Dr. Hohner. We are so pleased that you can be with us today. Dr. Hohner trained in medicine at Queen's University and in psychiatry at Columbia University. He is the Jack Bell Chair in Schizophrenia professor and was previously head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Hohner is also an honorary professor in the Department of Psychiatry, University of Hong Kong, and a lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry, Columbia University. He serves as a consultant psychiatrist to the BC Psychosis program based at UBC Hospital, and he's also on the BCSS Medical Advisory Committee. Dr. Hohner will be able to answer your questions after his presentation, but as always, we'll try to answer every question today, but I'm sure you'll have a lot of them. So please, if you have questions, be sure to get your questions in early. Please only use the Q&A window, not the chat box, to submit your question. Click on the Q&A button right below, not the chat. Some of you might need to move your cursor if you can't see the button right now, okay? All right, having said that, it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Hohner for his presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Renato, very much, and welcome. Good morning to everybody, and welcome to this presentation. I want to start, though, by just echoing a little bit of what Renato said in terms of different ways of knowing about schizophrenia. For me, that's been, you know, as a clinician and as a researcher, trying to understand it better and so on. But I really thank Phyllis for that brave presentation and giving us that kind of perspective, because understanding the experience of patients, people with schizophrenia themselves, as well as what their family members experience too, is so critical to this kind of work. So I'll give you a different kind of understanding and show you where I've been at and what I'm trying to do in terms of understanding it and what that might mean for some of our future. Okay, there we go. So yes, talking about the Jack Bell Chair in Schizophrenia. I am a university professor, and from that perspective, I do need to make a disclosure that that's not the only thing I do, as well as being a consultant, as Renato said, to the BC Psychosis program. I do some work with industry, those who make the medicines that our patients take, and I have grants from federal funding agencies, but the industry and the consulting work really doesn't impact on anything I'm going to be talking about today. What I am going to talk about is the chair itself. I think to help people understand what role this has had over the years, and how, for myself personally and for UBC and schizophrenia in general, in 3 different areas: the education area, the research. In research, we'll talk about a little bit about the brain and schizophrenia, how we hope we can unlock plasticity or some of the ways that the brain can be resilient in the illness. And reflecting on, some of what Phyllis was talking about, the role of relapse in the illness from a clinical sort of perspective. Then hopefully we'll have some time at the end, and so some thoughts on how research and clinical care might be linked together a little bit more closely, perhaps. So in the late 80s, BCSS approached UBC Faculty of Medicine to establish the first, things we do here out in BC are often firsts, for the first schizophrenia research chair. That's a position at the university dedicated to schizophrenia. The BCSS led the fundraising campaign. At that time, $1 million was needed to endow this kind of a chair. Philanthropist Mr. Jack Bell donated $500,000 to the cause. He received a letter from a BCSS member that led to that donation. And volunteers raised $250,000. The government matched that. Other UBC sources over the years have also supported that. So learning about Mr. Bell, some of you may know already, but he was a child of immigrants to Canada, was a very successful businessman in the peat and cranberry industries, but really for us, very committed to giving back to his community, was a generous donor and philanthropist, especially interested in health and well-being. He established a foundation in 1987, the Jack Bell Research Center at Vancouver General Hospital, the UBC Jack Bell School of Social Work, First Nations Center for Learning, Friends of the BCSS, that was called at that time, and established the Jack Bell Chair itself. Jack Bell Chair, the first holder of the Jack Bell Chair was Professor Peter Little on the left there. Peter is really well known, best I think, for his work looking at the symptoms of schizophrenia, how these symptoms cluster together in different kind of domains. Has done subsequently quite a bit of work with brain imaging in schizophrenia. He was at UBC from 1994 to 2000, then went back to Nottingham in England, where he still lives. I assumed the chair role in 2001. So being a university chair, there are terms of reference for the chair, one of which is the education area. I'll talk about this just really quickly in one particular example of role that I've had and what I continue to do in mentoring young people who are interested in either careers in research, the medical students themselves, and our residents in psychiatry. This is basically what I'm going to talk about. You may know Dr. Villa Rodriguez. I think he was the speaker at this donor event last year. Wonderful man, joined my group early on after he graduated from psychiatry in Spain, in Barcelona, where he's originally from. Joined us to do a PhD in neuroscience, which I was the mentor for Fidel on that. He also then became qualified to be a practicing psychiatrist in Canada, in British Columbia here, as part of that training program. Really is very interested in the ideas of neurostimulation with transcranial magnetic stimulation, a way to activate parts of the brain, to suppress perhaps the activity in other parts of the brain, to be helpful in a wide range of psychiatric illnesses, including schizophrenia, we hope, in the future. So that was just at Fidel's graduation, and he's still a very close colleague and is the director of the schizophrenia program academically at UBC. Research, though, and what we've been doing and what we hope to do in the future is mainly what I want to talk about. This is what the expectations of the holder of the Jack Bell Chair should be in terms of establishing an international program across the spectrum, from the biomedical to the health services, and to work with other scientists in the department and in other departments in the medical school, and as you'll see, internationally, to accomplish these kind of goals. So I think, as Renato mentioned, I started out my training at Columbia in New York, but also worked at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, which is an older picture when I was a trainee. In the center is Dr. Peter Davies, who was my mentor in terms of learning about brain science and pathology. On the left is Dr. Dennis Dixon, who's actually a very famous neuropathologist now. We developed some tools to study the brain in schizophrenia, to study proteins in the brain in patients who had passed away and had donated their brains for follow-up. This is just a picture of a particular place in the brain that we're very interested in. You can see my cursor here. This area, this shape is called the hippocampus, means a seahorse shape. Some people see in that. And this area of the brain, the hippocampus, is very important in memory and other things. It's important in a number of different illnesses, and schizophrenia is one of them. What the tools that I made do, they actually allow us to measure the amounts of special proteins, a family of proteins. Now, this one I'm showing in this kind of cartoon is part of a nerve cell. It's involved with communicating with another nerve cell. The way that nerve cells communicate is through these packages. The packages contain messengers or transmitters. The package is sort of waiting for a message, waiting for a stimulus to communicate a message to the next nerve cell in line. These packages have special proteins you see in these families of proteins in the other colors. The package has to be activated to bind and to actually fuse with the membrane so that the messengers, the neurotransmitters, dopamine is particularly important in that for schizophrenia. The dopamine can be released, or the other transmitters too, can be released and go across to a receptor on the next cell in line and stimulate that cell. This is how our memories work, how our planning works, how all the things, our emotions are felt in the brain through these messengers going back and forth. The package then gets recycled, gets loaded up again, and the next time a stimulus comes down, does its work as well. What we really have been able to do is use our tools to measure these things in the brain after death and look to see if there are differences in schizophrenia compared with people who didn't have schizophrenia in life. So this kind of panel, you see this seahorse shape again, the hippocampus. This is in a person who did not have schizophrenia. This is in a person who did have schizophrenia. What our tools allow us to see is some of these different proteins that were in the slide before, some of the different proteins, and anywhere there's more of that protein that's involved in this messaging function, anywhere there's more, you see dark. Different patterns for different proteins, that's all fine and so on. But really what's obvious is the major difference compared with the brain sample from this person who did have schizophrenia during their lifetime is there's less of these proteins. They're not completely absent, but there's quite a bit less of some of them compared to the person who did not have schizophrenia. And in fact, what we found when we look back in the charts, the medical records of the patients that had schizophrenia, the amount of the loss or reduction in these particular proteins related to the amount of kind of cognitive impairment, the difficulties they had with the activities of daily life and with memory while they were alive prior to their death. So interesting, and really was one of the first studies that made a connection between a molecular or protein mechanism in the brain and some of the symptoms, particularly of cognitive functioning and dysfunction that happened in the illness. This is, another very, talking some of the history of schizophrenia here. I like history. This is a man named Ramon y Cajal, a very famous Spanish physician who studied the hippocampus, the brain in individuals who had passed away. Back in those days, they didn't have cameras even for this work. You can see his microscope here. So Cajal actually had to do his work looking at these specimens during the day, and then he would draw them at night. This was a requirement back then. To be a scientist, you had to be able to draw things, which I think we've lost a bit today. Other, just again, of interest perhaps, I hope, to people, there's other famous schizophrenia psychiatrists who worked understanding the brain in schizophrenia in Germany now. This was in Munich. This man in the center, his name is Emil Kraepelin. He was really very important in describing the course of schizophrenia, what happened and changed in people with the illness over time, and really fundamentally allowed us to make the diagnosis of schizophrenia. A man who worked for him actually in Munich was Dr. Alzheimer, He discovered the changes in the brain that relate to Alzheimer's disease. He was also studying schizophrenia, as was Dr. Nissel, very well known for being able to look at these cells in the brain, and Galp, who was interested in some of the forensic or the trouble that people got into with mental disorders. Now, this is actually a picture my friend Peter Falkai, who I'll introduce, gave to me, of Dr. Kraepelin doing his ward round, looking at the patients and talking to them, which is, I participate in a ward round every week in our BC psychosis program. It's a little bit different than what you see here. I visited Peter in Munich, and sort of this is the room where they talk about new admissions, and maybe this was the chair that Kraepelin actually sat in. The Germans, they know that some of these chairs are the old chairs and some are the new ones, and the old ones are the ones that Kraepelin and Alzheimer may have sat in. So I was allowed to sit in one of those old chairs on my visit. Peter holds the academic chair that Kraepelin had, and maybe he sits in his chair. But Peter and I, we did do some exercising early on. Peter's an excellent skier. I was not. I don't ski anymore, but managed to keep up with him a bit. That was back in '91. We didn't always just ski, though. At some of these meetings, which were in nice places, we would talk about studies and plan research studies. And in the late '90s, we went on a hike, or a wander, as the Germans would call it. And Peter was very interested in this idea that, at that time we were learning from basic science that animals in the lab, if they exercised, there would be more neurons, more cells born in the hippocampus, actually, and the connections in the hippocampus would be enriched in animals. And so Peter thought, and we sort of designed a study to say, well, what about patients with schizophrenia that are in our hospitals and so on? If they were to exercise in a structured program, would we see a change in the hippocampus? And we can measure some of these things with brain imaging now, with magnetic resonance imaging. So we designed this study. We also brought in, at a meeting I coordinated in Vancouver, a colleague in Hong Kong, Professor Eric Chen, who was interested in this idea as well, to see what might happen. So in these studies, if you look, now this is the size of the hippocampus over here, bigger, smaller. This is the size in patients. Peter did this study in Germany, helped design it and analyze the data with the beginning, before they had exercise, and then in each individual patient after 3 months of aerobic exercise. You see that, and frankly, we were surprised that their hippocampus improved in size as well. In Professor Chen's work in Hong Kong, this was in actually young women with their first episode of schizophrenia. You can see that their hippocampus is actually larger than the chronic patients that Professor Falkai was studying. But still, we still saw a small and significant, in terms of measurement effects, change after a period of aerobic exercise. So this was really quite encouraging, surprising and encouraging for us. These same changes will happen in healthy people who have had a sedentary life and move into an exercise program. Now, how does this happen? We're interested in, could the mechanism be? Some of the researchers in the US had studied the change in blood flow to the hippocampus. And this is, again, our little seahorse you can sort of see here. These are the areas where they measured the blood flow. And they showed that some of the improvement in the size was related to actually increased blood flow. Another colleague, now a colleague, was my graduate student, Dr. Donna Lang, who's now an associate professor in radiology. She did her PhD with me, and Donna, as a faculty member at UBC, helped develop and apply a technique to look at the blood flow in patients with schizophrenia. This is our hippocampus, outlined in green here, and these are the blood vessels. You see the veins in blue, the arteries providing the blood flow in red. This is the magnetic resonance, the brain image, and you can see the veins actually with this technique. That's where the hippocampus is. So we looked at a group of patients in Vancouver, this again showing where those veins are. We looked at, in our BC Psychosis program out in UBC Hospital, at a group of actually quite treatment resistant. They had only a partial response of the illness to their treatment. In their hippocampus volume, They participated. Dr. Lang, developed an exercise program for them to participate in. And just like, they saw in Germany and in Hong Kong, there was an improvement in the volume of the hippocampus, the size of it. The veins didn't change though, overall. I mean, some went up, some went down. It wasn't a meaningful difference in the blood volume. So it's something else that's happening in the hippocampus, and I'm very interested in the idea actually that it is those connections between the nerve cell that we measure after death with our protein, our tools for measuring the proteins. It's the connections, and maybe to some extent, some of the nerve cells are being reborn after participation in the exercise. So this is just putting it all together, the work that I helped out design in Germany, in Hong Kong, and in Vancouver, showing in chronic stable patients in Germany, first episode patients in Hong Kong, and our treatment-resistant patients here at UBC and in British Columbia. This plasticity does exist in the hippocampus in schizophrenia if we have the right keys to unlock it. And I think exercise is one of those keys to unlock it. We do see some modest, but some improvement, perhaps in the cognition and perhaps in the symptoms of the illness for patients who can participate in these exercise interventions. This has been widely applied now by Professor Chen in their first episode programs in Hong Kong. A lot of involvement in these exercise programs, and something that Professor Chen's developed called FitMind. So from this part, I think we can conclude that the aerobic fitness is often low, associated with smaller volumes of the hippocampus, but with support, patients can participate in aerobic exercise. We all know how hard it is for anyone to get out there and do the exercise sort of things. We're optimistic that this is one way, and there might be others, to encourage the plasticity, that shape changing, the responsiveness, the resilience of the hippocampus in schizophrenia if we have the right keys into it. Clinically then, some of the work that we've been involved with over these years. Want to talk about the treatment guidelines for schizophrenia. I'm one of the co-authors, members of the panel that develops these guidelines. Understanding the course of the illness from the beginning to the outcome is really important. And these are just cartoons of some of the models of the course. What we want to focus on here is these relapses, as Phyllis was talking about, the relapses that patients have. And how these relapses, we want to prevent them. And really important in that is the question of how long are medications needed for, particularly in the first episode program. So in our guidelines in Canada, we follow the Scottish guidelines actually, and say that for patients with their first episode, after the symptoms have been resolved, so after they're fully treated, patients should stay on for at least 18 months. That is really the question. We're asked all the time by the patients who do have first episode, and it's really important for the guidelines to look at, well, is this right? How long do they really need to stay on medication after the first episode? With Professor Chen in Hong Kong, we designed a study to look at some of this that was carried out in Hong Kong. I visited there regularly in the past and helped Eric with the design and again, the analysis of this study. He runs a wonderful first episode program, was able to screen nearly 1,500 patients to see if they would participate in this study to understand how long the medication needs to be continued for. So to join the study, patients had to be treated for at least, first episode patients had to be treated at least 12 months with an antipsychotic. It was actually nearly 2 years. And then they were randomized to either continue for another year, so into a third year of treatment with antipsychotic medication, in this case it was Clozapine, or they would be randomized to placebo. We were looking to see if they had a relapse afterwards. And indeed, the ones who were randomized to the placebo were much less likely to continue without a relapse. They relapsed much more than those who stayed on the medication for that really third year. And really, so I think from learning from this study, perhaps in the future, our guidelines will need to be changed, that this 18 months, on which a lot of the literature and the other guidelines are going for, it maybe needs to be a little bit longer, quite a bit longer, in terms of how long that maintenance treatment should be maintained after the first episode. Well, so what? Some of our critics are, so what? And to paraphrase someone who's really very well known as an advocate for first episode programs, well, I don't worry so much about a relapse. Maybe it takes a relapse to come to grips with the illness. And I question that, to be frank. Really? So with our group, with our data that we had from the study we did, we said, let's look at it. Let's see what the long-term outcome is of the first episode, depending on whether or not that medication was continued into a third year. So we had the groups again. They had at least 1 year. It was really closer to 2. They either continued for another year or they went to the placebo. And again, with the wonderful programs they have in Hong Kong, Professor Chen was able to follow them up nearly 11 years after their first episode. And of interest, 80% were actually still taking antipsychotic medication, even those ones who had gone on the placebo for a year. They by the end of 10 more years, 80% were still on medication. Tells us something about the illness itself. So what did we see? We were particularly interested in preventing a poor outcome. And a poor outcome for us was they still have psychosis, they still have delusions or hallucinations after 10 years. They need clozapine for their treatment. Clozapine is used for the treatment-resistant patients, which is not the best outcome. We called that a poor outcome. Or they died due to suicide. So what we see is that the group that had the maintenance treatment in that third year, about 21% had a poor clinical outcome. In the group that had the placebo treatment in that third year, and again, 80% were back on medication by the end of follow-up, but 39% would have fallen into, at the long-term follow-up, that poor outcome group. So this tells us that that extra period of maintenance treatment is really important in leading to a good long-term outcome, preventing a poor long-term outcome. But we learned further that what the real key thing was in that maintenance treatment is preventing a relapse, because the pathway from a treatment early on to the long-term outcome, the pathway is not only direct, there's a part that's a direct pathway, but most of it is preventing the relapse of those symptoms. So really, I think we learned that some patients with first episode can have a very good response, no residual psychotic symptoms, can get back to work or school. But even after 2 years of treatment, the risk of relapse is high. And the antipsychotic medications can prevent this relapse in the longer term. Finally, I do work, and the clinical work, the consultation work is related to patients with treatment-resistant illness who are having only a partial response, and then part of the international group, which I'm proud to say has 7 Canadians on it from Toronto, Alberta, friends in Toronto as well as here in Vancouver. And we came up with criteria to describe and define what resistant illness was, because you need that in order to do proper research on it. And applying these kind of approaches and so on to what we've done with the long-term follow-up with Dr. Chen's group, some have treatment-resistant illness right from their first episode, they really don't have a good response right from the beginning, maybe about 8 to 10% actually. The more relapses that happened, the more likely it is that the illness becomes treatment resistant. And for those who do develop treatment resistance, more than half of them had that after their second relapse. That's their third episode. So it just reinforces how important it is from this perspective, to prevent those relapses, to ensure a patient is stable and doesn't evolve into having a treatment-resistant kind of illness. So I made this cartoon up and recently published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. If we look at that first episode, the severity of the symptoms with treatment, they come down maybe 15%, as many as don't actually come right back down to normal. but we've got optimism that they can with a treatment, a good treatment, but yet many patients, 65%, will experience a relapse. The chance, if they get to a relapse, of becoming chronic and not having a good functional recovery is much higher than if they do not experience a relapse. So it really just tries to put in a cartoon, sort of a time frame, what happens if relapses occur, what the likelihood of good or not so good outcomes is over time. So I think we've learned from this that the risk of relapse is after the initial treatment is high, if the medication is stopped, even after 2 years, that a relapse in the first 3 years will be part of the pathway to a poor clinical outcome. Preventing that relapse is part of the pathway to a good clinical outcome. If there is treatment resistance, it's really important to start this medication clozapine as soon as possible once the illness is described as with our criteria for treatment resistance, because the outcome is likely to be much better in those who have treatment resistant illness to start clozapine early. So just a little bit now on some of the things for the future. This is some of the other group, Bill McEwen in Vancouver that I work with, Jeff Smith, Peter again, and Eric in Germany. We did some work trying to boost up clozapine with another medication in those who have treatment-resistant illness. Unfortunately, this boosting strategy didn't make any difference. Everybody, all the patients that participated in the study, research is good for you, they improved somewhat, but there was no difference by adding a placebo pill compared with adding the risperidone on in terms of how much improvement there was. We need more tools, more medications, different strategies to try to overcome those who don't have a full response to clozapine. Clozapine responses are probably in 40 to 50% of those who have treatment-resistant illness, but we work still at BC Psychosis program and elsewhere with those who need something else. Where we're at in terms of looking at something else, we're still just making our recommendations based on our best experience, really. And there's a couple of medications that seem to offer promise, but have not yet been studied in enough detail in these treatment-resistant patients to know just how much they will be able to boost the clozapine up. That's something to look forward to in the future. This is just Detweiler, where I do my consulting work, home of the BC Psychosis program. Tell you some of the things that we do there. And this is a first-person report from the Globe and Mail of one of our patients, 24 years old, just into post-secondary, experiencing psychosis, wanted to be a sound engineer and a songwriter, huddling on the sofa, forcing my eyes to stay open because the Black Klan was, this is the patient's experience, threatening to torture me. Sure can't get much homework done in that kind of state. With the patient's stay at BC Psychosis program, one of the treatments we use in addition to the medicines, as Dr. alluded to with Dr. Villa Rodriguez, is a neurostimulation, electroconvulsive therapy. And it helps this man with the illness, that the depression part of his illness, patients with schizophrenia can have depression too. It improved, doesn't hear the voices, or maybe sometimes, but he knew they gained insight that they're not real. Future needs, opportunities, this is in the Globe and Mail a few days ago. Why are our health records just not as good as our financial records, even in British Columbia? Why are they not as good and accessible as they are in Hong Kong? So we're able to do this kind of work there. Trying to develop some infrastructure, trying to have schizophrenia-specific aspects of records that could be available online to hospitals, across hospitals, to outpatient care, to the family doctors, to the psychiatrists, to the patients, and if the patients agree, to family members themselves. That would really, I think, be a step forward that research could contribute to in terms of what is important to be part of the records. Can we develop these kind of tools? Should we reestablish a provincial clozapine clinic, which we had at Riverview Hospital in the past? I think it's important that we learn about patients' experiences outside of these clinic visits. negative symptoms, how common and severe are they across all the patients, across the different places in our province? What are the implications of these kind of symptoms of loss of volition, of feeling empty? What are the implications, loss of drive, for the capability that patients have or for their disabilities? Comorbidity, the overlap of substance use and of schizophrenia is so important. And again, another separate study that would take a whole session to talk about. We're looking at these kind of things. I really want to, reflect and thank those who have allowed me to have an experience at Riverview Hospital. This is a drawing of the hospital back in the day that was done by a patient, actually. That was our team in the BC Psychosis program back in those times at Riverview Hospital. Dr. Bill McEwen has been just a vital colleague of mine for all these years. That picture on the left was when I was awarded the Jack Bell Chair, and Dr. Randall White is the medical director of the BC Psychosis program now. It's a pleasure to work with them. So I hope this, I hope I'm more of a traveler. I sort of am a fan of William Blake, a famous artist in England back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. That's a drawing he did of a traveler. But if I am a wanderer, I reflect on the Fellowship of the Ring from Tolkien. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. So I hope in the Jack Bell Chair, I can be continuing to contribute to understanding of schizophrenia from this sort of perspective over many years to come. And I sincerely thank all of you who have been donating to the activities of the Society and to research activities over these years. Thanks very much. And I think we have some time for questions, and happy to interact with Renato on those kind of things that we can.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Hohner, for such an interesting and visual presentation. It really helps us to understand a lot of things when we can see things visually. So I have a lot of questions that have started to come in. We have about 25 minutes or so, and I'm going to, just for the benefit of all of you on the webinar, your questions are coming in and they're being fed to me individually. I'm not picking the questions, they're being evaluated and then sent along to me. So hopefully we'll get to all of the key ones. And let me start with the very first one for you, Dr. Hohner. And this has to do with biomarkers. So this was a question that was submitted in writing, and I'll just read it to you. One of the many things about schizophrenia is that there doesn't seem to be any physical biomarker to assist with diagnosis. It's frustrating to have the disorders dismissed as emotional distress or quaint eccentricity. The quote unquote anti-psychiatry mob implies that schizophrenia is something made up by big pharma and calls the DSM-5 or DSM-V the billing Bible. How close are we to getting something physical, a biomarker or blood test or scan or something that would enable a specific diagnosis, perhaps earlier than what happens now?
Yeah, I certainly sympathize with the questioner on this. It is one of the criticisms we get. Unfortunately, I think we're a long ways away from having a specific lab test or brain imaging test that would say, this is schizophrenia, this is bipolar disorder, manic depression, or something like that. Really, it's going to be for quite some time up to us as clinicians to look at the criteria, to look for the positive symptoms of psychosis and the loss of function and so on that define the illness. I am much more optimistic, though, that the tests and the biomarkers, the things we can measure in the blood or with brain imaging or with other sort of strategies, might help us get specific types of schizophrenia, to help us understand what aspects of the illness, what mechanisms are happening with some of the specific aspects. In fact, Dr. Bob Stowe in the BC Psychosis program and others, a UBC graduate, Dr. Ann Bassett, has looked at genetic origins of some cases of schizophrenia, and it's rare, but there are some that it seems there is a genetic basis that can be detected in the chromosomes for schizophrenia. So that's an example of something. so far the treatments we would use would be the same and the outcomes would be the same, but perhaps it does help with families to understand the origins of the illness. But I think those same origins, the same mechanisms are there in many patients that have the illness. So you can be quite assured that, we still do have a medical and sort of biological basis for the very meaningful psychological and social impairments that happened in the illness that really we hope that with medications and with other treatments supplementing the medication effects, that we can get a better quality of life for the patients with the illness.
Thank you. Here's a question now from Susan Inman. Can you estimate the percentage of people with schizophrenia who have severe and persistent mental illnesses despite receiving medically based and psychosocial rehabilitation treatments?
Yeah, good to hear from you again, Susan. I think it's about 30%, about a third, really are continue to have delusions, hallucinations that are really there most days of the week and are really quite impaired by their illness and need a fairly long-term kind of care. So we're still thinking that what we would call treatment-resistant form of illness is about a third. Another third have, still some degree of disabilities and, maybe are not able to fully work or have such meaningful, social relationships and so on. And about another 30% really can do very well with the illness.
Okay, thanks. You talked quite a bit in your presentation about some of the work that you did with Dr. Chen. And we have a question about community mental health teams. And it's kind of related to the information that you were sharing about your studies, but this is slightly different. And this talks specifically about the community health teams. The question is this: what about the research that shows that antipsychotic medication discontinuation trials by these community mental health teams are effective and good risk management strategy for clients that have had already many times suffered devastating relapses without any gain in insight from such trials? So I think the question, if I understand it correctly, is there anything to be learned from these trials that the community mental health teams have done? I hope I haven't misunderstood the tone of the question, but maybe you have a comment on this, Dr. Hohner.
Certainly in patients that have had multiple relapses, we would not recommend discontinuing medications. And I'm not sure, the specifics around the question and so on. That would not be something that is done particularly at all. I mean, rarely in the BC Psychosis program, in the inpatient unit, if we need to clarify someone's diagnosis or really look at side effects and so on, we might have in a controlled environment a brief period of discontinuing medication, but that's not something we do very often at all in terms of what we like to see. The issue that I was particularly talking about is more in the first episode where someone's only had one episode, never had a relapse, whether or not they can be safely discontinued. And the work would show that the chances of having a relapse will be higher if they're discontinued, especially in the first 3 years of that, after that illness has had its onset.
Yeah, it's because we know that there are people that have been gaining some popularity in suggesting that people can take care of themselves without being on medication. But it sounds like you're saying the science seems to be pointing in the opposite direction.
I would say so. I mean, but that's not to disparage or anything, that the environment that patients live in and the amount of supports they have in terms of supported employment opportunities, in terms of adequate housing, in terms of psychosocial support are really important in supplementing and allowing, I think, what we think about in some ways is that the medication allows patients to engage more fully with the other kinds of treatments that are available and with their environment, that should be a supportive environment.
Great. Thank you. So the next question is from Christine G, and it goes like this. How do you address problems with motivation? For example, encouraging people living with schizophrenia to exercise and or participate in other activities?
Yeah, motivation and drive and sort of seeking to accomplish one's goals and so on, that can be part of the illness in terms of what we call the negative symptoms of the illness. The positive symptoms are things that people who don't have schizophrenia would not experience. So a positive symptom is something added on to ordinary mental life, like a hallucination or a delusion. The negative symptoms are things in ordinary mental life that are taken away or missing in those who have the illness. And motivation and drive is one of those things that can be lost in the illness. Unfortunately, most of our medications don't have a significant boost on the negative symptoms. They're not as effective as they are with the positive symptoms and with preventing relapse. So we need other strategies. We need things like, motivational interviewing, for example, in terms of how psychological strategies might help with encouraging patients, encouraging any of us, coaching, if you will, to get out there and participate in exercise programs, to have social skills training and so on. These are the strategies we have now. We are optimistic, though, that some of the newer medications that have come on in the last few years, if we get the dosing right, if we get the adding on strategies right and so on, where we use those, maybe there will be some benefits around the negative symptoms themselves, but exercise can do it if it can contribute to it. It's not a cure-all. If patients can be in programs that support them to do this. Most of the exercise studies that I showed you, it's a team exercise, right? They get 4 or 5 of the patients together. They have a comely trainer with them, the same things that would encourage us all to exercise. In terms of doing these things, this has to be built in, I think, to some of our ongoing care of individuals with the illness.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it certainly sounds that exercise can benefit all of us, regardless of our mental health. We can all use it. It's fantastic. Here's a question that was emailed from one of our attendees today. I was wondering if the studies showing that persons with schizophrenia have 5 times increased mortality risk and 3 times the hospitalization risk from COVID-19, second only to age as a risk factor. So this person is wondering if these studies have been followed up with strong measures of the local health systems to facilitate immunization in this vulnerable population. Do you know?
Yeah, so we have seen in international reports that patients with schizophrenia have increased rates of becoming infected with COVID-19 and these kind of things. So it's complicated to understand why. I think that it's a lot of the kind of psychosocial factors, if you will. It's not that their immune systems, as far as we understand, are weakened or anything like that. It's they have a more chance to be exposed to the illness, and perhaps less opportunities, as with many aspects of medical care, to access medical care for things like vaccines, which protect us from the illness. And so, that we really need to look at. What we did do, and I was, a member of our treatment-resistant group internationally, and a colleague in Australia spearheaded this. I managed to get it into a Canadian journal. We put out some recommendations specifically for patients who require Clozapine on what to do during the pandemic to ensure that they can safely stay on Clozapine, because there would be hesitation. Well, should I go in for my blood test? Because maybe, I'll get exposed to COVID if I go in for my blood test. Should I stop the Clozapine now? And again, our recommendations were, perhaps the time between blood tests could be extended out a bit during the COVID epidemic, that it wasn't so necessary to place oneself at risk by going in and whatnot at times, and to really encourage vaccination and to stay on Clozapine during the time and so on. So we have made some efforts, but I don't believe that there has been a specific provincial effort in terms of the public health recommendations or so on to immunize patients, with any kind of priority. Certainly those that are hospitalized and in the BC psychosis program, we make every effort to ensure that they are immunized during their inpatient stay if they haven't been already.
Okay. Question from Jane Duval. Do you have any suggestion as to what can be done to raise awareness among medical and other professionals working with schizophrenia patients regarding the serious cognitive deficits that are a core feature of the illness and most predictive of outcomes? There's a huge knowledge gap here, especially in community mental health.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a very good question, Jane, and worked with for many years. I think that we need, again, to focus on the education of medical students and, getting at it, the sort of the early days in explaining and understanding the biological, the brain parts of the illness, what can be changed, what cannot. And I'm sure Susan Inman will be thinking about the role that cognitive remediation therapy, working with a psychologist and working with some of the digital approaches to improve cognition is important, that there are opportunities to do this. I think, there is a need, and one of the projects I would like to see happening is to develop kind of screening tests, for older patients with possible memory impairment or dementia, that as we age, we have these screening tests that can be done in 5 or 10 minutes by a physician, the mini mental or the Montreal cognitive assessment, the MOCA they're called. We don't really have those yet that are more specific to the kinds of cognitive impairments that happened in schizophrenia, which are not only in memory that we really, these other tests are designed for. So I think from the research perspective, something going forward that I would like to do is understand better the problems and try and develop and apply some screening tests. Because if we could engage the clinicians with something that they could do in terms of screening for cognitive impairment, to know which patients might need to go to the neuropsychologist for some more detailed testing that is very hard to access, but have some screening tools to use, which requires research, but to have some tools like that might sort of lead to a wider distribution of the understanding and the ability to test for these cognitive impairments would really be a step forward.
Okay. Do you need a drink of water or anything? Because we've got more questions rolling in. You okay?
I'm good. I'm fine for now.
Okay. Here's another question from Christine G. How do you distinguish, and you touched on this during your presentation a little bit, but there's more here. How do you distinguish hippocampal abnormalities in terms of disease versus medication changes? Have there been robust studies of brains of people who have not taken antipsychotics?
Yes, so there are. One of the strategies, as is pointed out in the question, I think, is to look at the hippocampus in patients at their first episode when they've had minimal or no treatment. And that would, again, support that there are small. In a group of patients, they will have smaller hippocampus than in a group of people or patients who don't have schizophrenia. It's not a test that can give an answer in an individual kind of patient. But what we've also done is look at patients, and Dr. Lang has done some of this work in Vancouver. We've looked at patients who have changed medications from some of the old medications to some of the new medications to look at the changes in the brain structures that happened with those. There are actually, going to the newer medications that we've had over the last 10 or 15 years, actually some improvements in terms of what we had seen and in different brain regions. The hippocampus doesn't seem to be one of the sensitive ones, actually, to the medication effects, either for better or worse. It's more the parts of the brain that are involved with the movement disorders and so on that show improvements after switching the medications and so on. So we do think that this is, in groups, helpful for us understanding the parts of the brain that are affected by the illness, but unfortunately, it's not yet useful as an individual testing strategy, maybe in the future.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hohner, it's about 12:23, and we have another 4 questions that have come in. Would you be willing to answer the next 4? Or
Sure.
maybe if we run out of time, maybe we can shorten the answers, but I hope we can get through these 4 questions. So here we go. This one was submitted anonymously online. A significant proportion of people with this disease suffer from anosognosia, so they're not accessing treatment. This is an essential area of research. Is your group doing any work here?
So anosognosia is the inability to recognize that you have a symptom or you have an illness. This can happen in patients with strokes, for example, and so on, but it is quite common in schizophrenia. It overlaps with the lack of insight that patients have. We're not specifically looking at this aspect of things in terms of research strategies at the present time.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Alice Thompson. Do you have a sense of how long the disease is brewing before it becomes clinically evident?
It's a real good question. There are risk factors, probably from childhood, from schools. Kids who go on to have schizophrenia are more often bullied than kids who don't. I mean, lots of kids are bullied and don't develop schizophrenia too, though. These are risk factors. I think probably most would say it's a year or 2, perhaps, of change in behavior, of decline and so on, prior to the first episode per se, which is often the positive symptoms that lead to coming into care.
Okay, thank you. Next, there are a couple of questions about what life is like for people with schizophrenia in the later years. In other words, after age 65. Is dementia common? Do some people live well with the illness? Some people also believe that most people with schizophrenia get well eventually. So I'm not sure if you want to take those in order, but it's really about life in senior years and whether there's a connection with dementia. Yeah,
there is, a degree of cognitive impairment we've been talking about throughout the illness and so on. It's still not quite clear how much that creates risk for dementia, severe memory impairment and functional decline, like with Alzheimer type dementia and so on, in terms of older patients with schizophrenia. If anything, we have also seen, the overall would say that those who don't suffer the early mortality that was pointed out earlier may in their older years actually do a bit better than they had earlier, less prominent effects of the positive symptoms and action on those positive symptoms that can lead to getting into a lot of problems. So yeah, I think there's some perhaps modulation and adaptation over those later years of the illness after 65 to having something that's not so different from others.
And that part 2 of the question was, do people eventually get better, or do they just live with it forever?
I would say there would be still some symptoms, some evidence of the illness. It is just not as prominent and not causing as many difficulties in day-to-day life.
Okay. Jean Swenerton asks, what is the latest information about possible viral triggers of schizophrenia?
Right. So these, we can think of this in 2 ways. One is risk factors. Early work showed that exposure to the influenza virus during pregnancy, particularly in the second trimester, could increase the risk of schizophrenia in individuals. I actually was a second trimester during that 1957 epidemic. Fortunately, in my family, didn't lead to onset of schizophrenia. So it can create a risk, small, but can create a risk if the mom-to-be is exposed to a virus during pregnancy. We think that some cases anyways may have it as a precipitating factor in a predisposed person to developing the illness. We're learning more and more now. It's a very active area of research about the immune system. Again, we're learning more because of COVID, but learning about the immune system, how the body, if you separate the body and the brain, how the body, the immune system in the body does talk to the brain. And the brain talks to the immune system, modulates things and so on. The extent to which exposure to a virus, the immune response to the virus might contribute to some of the changes in the brain actually that affect these synapses in terms of their reactivity and so on is an important area of interest and really a very active area of research from the genetics perspective as well. Dr. Beasley at UBC is looking at some of the brain proteins that are involved with the immune response that could be changed, triggered in viral infections, and particularly in that regard.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your quick answers, because we've got a couple more minutes and I've got two last questions for you. Are there any negative side effects? This comes from Roberta Seed. Are there any negative side effects as a result of long-term use of Clozapine?
The main, side effect with Clozapine that creates concern is weight gain, and the connection with type 2 diabetes and so on. That would be a long-term concern. I will just emphasize, though, that in patients with antipsychotic medication, this is work from Scandinavia, looking at hundreds of thousands of patients and in their excellent medical records. The highest risk for heart disease in schizophrenia and for dying of heart disease is in patients who are on no medication. The risk does go up if there's multiple medications or so on, but yet the highest risk is no medications at all. That's not to say that we shouldn't be having exercise and good diet and all those kind of things in patients with schizophrenia, just like for the rest of us, to prevent heart disease. That would be the major concern with Clozapine is the weight gain and the glucose dysregulation, which can be treated, with metformin and other medications for the diabetes-related risk, and with the exercise, diet, and so on to prevent the weight gain as much as possible.
Okay. Well, the last question, Dr. Hohner, comes from Bob Baker. And his question is, in your opinion, this is really looking at the future. In your opinion, what is the most promising area of schizophrenia research?
I think on the applied aspect, it is really, developing some of these tools, I think we need a better infrastructure in this province to allow us to look at clinical research, to try to get some of the strategies we have, both in terms of the non-pharmacological treatments, and to let us look at the pharmacological treatments better in this interaction between, the extent to which we can do things with medications that maybe are better for negative symptoms, better for some of the loss of motivation and things we've been talking about, allow patients to better engage with the other treatments that are available. So I would really, I think, prioritize trying to do something on these tools. I made tools to look at the brain proteins and so on, and I think we need some tools that are more directly applied, that can be applied with digital technologies, with these aspects for both assessment and for our record keeping, so we know better what's happening with patients in the illness. BC Cancer Agency is really the flagship on keeping track of patients that have cancer, that have problems that can recur, that can have relapses and so on. We need to up our game in mental disorders, mental illness, to have the kind of healthcare system that looks after them as just as well as we do in our province look after patients with cancer.
Fantastic. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hohner. It's actually interesting you talk about this last point you made about studying treatments, and actually the foundation will have something very exciting to announce, hopefully next week or in the next couple of weeks for sure. So please stay tuned to us for that. We'll give you updates when we can share them. Whenever we have someone of your stature, there is always more questions that come in than we have time for. So we've really run out of time today. We will reach out to Dr. Hohner to see if he'd be willing to answer some of these questions after the event. And so hopefully, Bill, maybe we can get back to people with some answers to some of these questions in the future. So please stay in touch with us. On behalf of all of us at the foundation, I really feel like we're part of a big family. All of the people that are members of the society, all of the people that support the foundation through their generous donations, the research community, we're all in this together. And thanks again, Dr. Hohner, for answering all these questions. As you can see, there's a huge interest in what's happening in this area of research. So big thumbs up from all of us, and thank you for giving us of your time on a Saturday. Wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you, and stay safe and good holidays for all.
Okay. Well, just a few more comments before we allow everybody to go. I just wanted to say that if you'd like to review any part of our discussion, we are going to be adding a summary, a video, and a kind of a transcript from today's event, and they will be on our websites. That's bcss.org and bcssfoundation.org. We'll also be emailing you a link, so you really don't have to do anything. You just have to click when you get it. It's that simple. So please keep an eye in your inbox for that information so that you can review anything that's been shared today. And as we wrap up our time together, I'd like to once again thank our sponsors for today's virtual event, and that is, as you've heard, the Otsuka-Lundbeck Alliance, who allowed us to organize this without dipping into your valuable donations. And lastly, before you leave, please take a few minutes to fill out the survey that will pop up as you leave Zoom. Your comments will help us improve future event. Thank you so much for your fantastic support. We are truly, truly grateful. Please have a wonderful, safe holiday season, and best wishes to all of you. Really appreciated the time together. Bye.